Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. It's easy to forget that once a book could get you excommunicated, not for what is said about war or politics or even the divine, but sometimes just for the questions it asked. A quiet paragraph, a footnote, a single sentence that hinted the earth might not be the center of the universe, or that the soul could perhaps be understood outside the teachings of the Church. For centuries, the Vatican decided which books the faithful were never allowed to read. This wasn't just a matter of theology. It was about control, and over time, the forbidden book list, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, grew into one of the most chilling shelves in the world. Yet, like all things in the archives, it did not begin with malice. It began with order. In the early 1500s, Europe was changing. The printing press had transformed ideas into something cheap, something that could travel. No longer limited to monks copying texts by candlelight, knowledge now had legs, and not everyone was thrilled about that. As heresies multiplied and splinter sects formed across the continent, the Catholic Church found itself both surrounded and exposed. Protestant books poured from northern presses, often in vernacular languages that anyone could understand. Rome responded not with debate, but with silence and censorship. In 1559, under Pope Paul IV, the Church created a formal list of banned books. It was not short, nor was it subtle. The first edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum filled several printed pages and included works by dozens of theologians, scientists, and philosophers. The reasons were vague: errors in faith, corruption of morals, heresy. Among the earliest entries, Niccolo Machiavelli, Erasmus of Rotterdam, and a man named Girolamo Cardano would dare to write about mathematics and dreams in the same manuscript. To understand why the Church felt the need to catalog dangerous ideas so meticulously, you must first understand what the Index wasn't. It wasn't a mere suggestion. It was doctrine. A Catholic who read a banned book could face excommunication. A printer who published one could be jailed. And in some regions, even owning a listed book could bring the Inquisition to your door. But the real power of the Index didn't lie in enforcement. It lay in fear. Quiet, invisible fear. The kind that seeps into libraries and makes scholars close their shutters before opening a page. By the 17th century, the Index had become something more than a list. It had become a map of forbidden knowledge, and the Vatican had a copy of every book on that map. Now, imagine the shelves inside the Vatican Apostolic Archive, once known as the Secret Archive. There's a long corridor near the old reading hall. No windows, no natural light. It's just smooth walls of white and cream, and the faint scent of aging vellum. Along one wall stands a sequence of high wooden cabinets, mostly unmarked, but above one of the doors, a brass plaque reads only in DZ Antici, ancient indexes. Inside, row upon row of books that were never supposed to be read. But here's the strange part. The Vatican didn't burn these books. It collected them over the centuries. As each new edition of the Index was published, some 32 in total, Vatican officials gathered the very volumes they banned. They wrapped them in brown cloth, cataloged them in tiny, handwritten Latin ledgers, and shelved them deep in the archives, where only a select few scholars were permitted to examine them. Why? Because even forbidden knowledge had to be understood. If the Church was to refute it, it had to first read it. And if history was to be preserved, it could not be erased entirely, only hidden. Thus, The index did not erase knowledge. It mummified it, wrapped in silence, bound in obedience. One of the most frequently requested items in this collection today is a small quarto volume from 1616, bound in dark green leather with a fading gold title, De Revolutionibus Orbium Coelestium. You might recognize it as the book where Nicolaus Copernicus proposed that the earth revolved around the sun. It sat, untouched, in the Vatican shelves for 300 years. Next to it, in one particular drawer, is an edition of Candide by Voltaire, and several philosophical treatises by Baruch Spinoza works that questioned not the church directly, but the structure of belief, ethics, and power. Each was labeled in careful handwriting, damnatus, condemned, yet none were destroyed. The shelves only grew longer. What's fascinating is how the reasons for inclusion evolved over time. In the 1500s and 1600s, the index focused on theological errors and heresy. By the 1800s, it began banning novels, fiction, love stories, political satire. Even Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species was banned not initially for blasphemy, but for disrupting natural theology. At times, the decisions were bureaucratic. A book might be banned, not for its content, but because its publisher had printed something else objectionable. Entire catalogs were condemned by association. This led to absurd results. Some editions of Don Quixote were on the index, others were not. Some works by Descartes were banned, others were merely discouraged. In one case, the Children's History of the Saints was placed on the list because it described martyrdom, too vividly frightening young readers into asking questions about divine mercy. Yet, the church was never monolithic in how it enforced the index. Local bishops had latitude, and not all of them agreed. In Poland, for example, certain banned books circulated quietly among Catholic intellectuals. In Italy, priests often kept copies hidden behind altars or inside lecterns. And in France, entire underground networks of booksellers thrived in defiance of a list, many of whom supplied rare copies to Vatican archivists themselves. So, what was the point? Why maintain a list that could not be enforced completely? Perhaps the real power of the index wasn't in its implementation, but in its existence. A signal, a reminder that someone was watching, and perhaps more importantly, that someone was recording today. The Vatican's 53 miles of shelves include multiple cabinets dedicated solely to index-related materials, drafts of condemnation letters, marginal notes scribbled by cardinals, handwritten debates between theologians over whether a certain metaphor constituted heresy. Some of these documents have never been studied in depth. Others are open only to researchers with advanced clearance. The index itself was finally abolished in 1966 by Pope Paul VI. After over 400 years of use, the Church announced it would no longer maintain a formal list of prohibited books. But the archives remain, and the shelves are still there, silent, still holding the memory of every idea once deemed too dangerous to be read aloud. What does it mean, then, to keep a record of forbidden thought? Is it a contradiction? Or is it the ultimate act of control? The Index Librorum Prohibitorum was never just about censorship. It was about cataloging dissent, about knowing, down to the page number, its ideas had the power to stir the soul in the wrong direction. And so the shelves grew, not as a tomb, but as a mirror, reflecting what the church feared, and, perhaps, what it secretly respected. After all, if an idea truly meant nothing, would you bother to ban it? Or would you lock it in the cabinet, wrap it in silence, and hope it never whispers again? If you were a Catholic scholar in 17th century Italy, it meant walking a narrow path between illumination and obedience. And if, by candlelight, you happened to open a book from the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, well, you did not read it for pleasure. You read it carefully, quietly, and with one eye on the door, because books on the index weren't just banned, they were dangerous. But for some, that danger only deepened their pull. In the cities of Florence, Naples, and Venice, quiet groups of scholars began to form, unofficially referred to as a silenciosith, silent ones. They did not shout their dissent. They did not challenge the church outright. Instead, they copied, commented, and discussed banned works in hushed tones. They debated Descartes without uttering his name. They quoted Galileo, but referred to him as Il Toscano, the Tuscan, and above all, they read, because to read was to remember, and to remember was to resist the forgetting that censorship demands. In a letter dated 1687, preserved in the margins of a personal diary, now stored in the Vatican Library's private collection, one scholar wrote, "I keep the index, as others keep the scriptures, beside my bed, not because I follow it, but because I must know what not to be seen reading." This was the strange paradox of the index. It told the world which books were dangerous, and in doing so, it advertised them. Imagine walking into a bookseller's back room, where plain volumes were hidden beneath heavy cloth. When you asked for Spinoza, the shopkeeper would raise an eyebrow, say nothing, and hand you a worn copy with the spine scraped clean. You would open it slowly, inhaling dust and old ink, and begin to read ideas that, by their very banning had been made immortal. In truth, many of the books on the index were never widely read at all. Some were obscure treatises, academic arguments, or foreign pamphlets that only a few dozen people in Europe had ever seen. But once they were listed, they gained a strange allure. In some cases, authors even celebrated their inclusion. Being banned was a mark of seriousness, a strange sort of success. It's proof that your ideas had stirred the ancient heart of the church, just enough to warrant a whisper of fear. One writer, the French satirist Rétif de la Breton, joked in a letter, "To be published is vanity, to be banned immortality." But there was also a tragedy. Not everyone who read from the index escaped unscathed. In Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, ownership of banned books could lead to public penance, or, worse, a merchant in Seville was condemned for lending Lazarillo de Torres to his neighbor, unaware that certain editions had been placed on the index for depicting clergy in a satirical light. In Portugal, a schoolteacher was exiled for quoting Montaigne's essays without citation. In Rome itself, printers were arrested simply for having the wrong typeface, one that resembled the print used in banned Protestant tracts. And then there were the books that disappeared, not destroyed, not burned, but quietly erased, removed from libraries, forgotten by citation, moved from memory, not by force, but by slow starvation. The Vatican, of course, kept them all. The secret was not to erase ideas, but to own them. A strange policy was developed inside the congregation of the Index of Church office responsible for maintaining the banned book list. It was called expurgatio. Under this rule, certain banned books could be read and even reprinted, but only if the offensive passages were removed or censored. This often resulted in entire chapters being blacked out, pages with inked margins, prefaces rewritten, footnotes added to correct heresies. It created strange, mutilated Books Frankenstein editions, where silence was stitched into the gaps of thought. One copy of Erasmus' Praise of Folly survives in the Vatican archives, where every instance of irony about monks has been replaced with blank white space. The margins are silent, the laughter amputated, but somehow the soul of the book remains. The process of expurgation wasn't purely religious, it was also bureaucratic. Each banned book had to be evaluated, often by a panel of theologians, linguists, and scribes. They debated whether an adjective was too suggestive, whether a metaphor might imply dualism, whether a quote from Plato could be taken out of context to suggest independent morality. This wasn't censorship by rage. It was censorship by committee, a slow, meticulous, dismantling of thought. Sometimes the process took years. The great irony: these panels often read the books more carefully than anyone else. They became, inadvertently, the most thorough readers of the very text they sought to silence. Over time, index began to falter under its own weight. By the 1800s, Enlightenment thinking had spread across Europe. Universities were no longer strictly under religious control. New scientific societies flourished in cities like Paris, Berlin, and Edinburgh, and literacy rates were climbing faster than the church could print condemnations. Even as new editions of the index continued to be released, fewer and fewer people obeyed it. But inside the Vatican, the work continued. A staff of clerks and archivists maintained the forbidden shelves. They repaired bindings, translated controversial passages, annotated records of ownership and distribution. They weren't inquisitors, they were librarians, and in many ways, their quiet duty was the most radical act of all, because while the index screamed, "Do not read," they read anyway. One of the most remarkable stories buried in the Vatican archives is that of Father Matteo Frugoni. He was never famous, never published, never canonized, but he spent 42 years cataloging books on the index dot each day. He entered the narrow reading rooms, opened a small wooden cabinet, and studied the works the world was not supposed to see. He wrote no judgments, only summaries, notes, cross-dash references. He became a ghost among forbidden ideas, and at the end of his life, left a single handwritten note folded into the back of a ledger. It read, in silence, "Even heresy teaches." You don't know what happened to him after that, but the ledger is still there. You can still smell the paper. So, what did it mean to be a reader in an age of silence? To know that knowledge was not free, that it could be taken, hidden, twisted, or burned, but also collected, preserved, even loved. In 1948, a scholar visiting the Vatican's archive asked to see the original 1559 edition of the index. The librarian paused, then led him down a stone hallway. They passed room after room, shelves of parchment, codices, folios, and then, finally, the book, bound in red leather. Gilt edges. It looked innocent, quiet, but inside was the trace of centuries' names crossed out. Ideas buried, dissenting thoughts that refused to disappear. The index is gone now, officially, but its echoes remain in libraries, in algorithms, in whispers. Even now, somewhere, someone is deciding what should not be read, and that leaves one quiet, lingering question. If the forbidden books are now free, then what are the new forbidden ideas? And who is writing this century's index? You've followed the index across centuries, its birth in the throes of religious war, its quiet cultivation behind Vatican walls, its lists whispered from scribe to scholar like a secret inheritance. But what happened next is neither dramatic nor abrupt. The death of the index did not come with fire or denunciation. It came with disinterest. It faded the way most institutions did not, with resistance, but with irrelevance. The year was 1966, a time of global movement. The Second Vatican Council had ended the previous year, signaling a sea change within the Catholic Church. Bishops and theologians gathered to address the modern world, not to condemn it, but to engage with it. Liturgies shifted from Latin to vernacular languages. Dialogue with non-Catholics became encouraged rather than punished. The index, once the Church's sharpest sword, now looked like a rusted relic on the wall. So Pope Paul VI issued a quiet declaration. The index librorum prohibitorum was no longer in effect. No dramatic ceremony marked its end. No public apology was issued. The decision was tucked into a footnote of church reform. The index would no longer have the force of ecclesiastical law. It was not condemned. It was simply retired. And that, perhaps, was its final triumph. For if the index had been denounced outright, it might have flared up one last time, revived by controversy. But by letting it drift gently into obscurity, the church ensured that it passed silently into memory. Or, so they hoped. You might imagine that the end of the index brought liberation to theologians, scholars, and Catholic academics. And in many ways, it did. Books once buried behind locked shelves were now openly cited. Universities revised curricula. Translators resurrected censored manuscripts. The walls that once divided, permitted knowledge from forbidden, began to dissolve. But the index had done its work far more thoroughly than any imagined, because it had shaped habits. It had molded not just what people read, but how they read, how they approached knowledge itself, with caution, with defensiveness, with the quiet question always pressing at the edge of thought. Is this allowed? That kind of internalized fear does not disappear with a decree. It lingers in academic gatekeeping, in self-censorship, in the studied silence of those who could challenge orthodoxy, but don't. Even today, it's deep in the Vatican secret archive. There is a room seldom visited where a full, chronological set of the index editions is stored. From the first fiery version of 1559 to the final edition of 1948, the bindings are different. Some are thin, pamphlet-like volumes. Others are thick tomes with elaborate covers, heavy gold lettering, and creaking spines. Each bears the weight of an era's anxieties, its enemies, its chosen boundaries of truth. And as you flip through the pages, a pattern emerges. Certain names recur again and again. Others appear once, vanish, and are never seen again. You start to notice that some books were not placed on the index for what they said, but for who said them. A Protestant theologian writing about free will would be condemned. A Catholic bishop saying nearly the same thing might be overlooked. You notice that entire categories of human experience, philosophy, science, satire, autobiography, were treated with suspicion if they suggested a world not governed entirely by ecclesiastical law. You realize the index was never only about heresy. It was about control. And control, once learned, is not easily forgotten. In Latin America, for instance, where the church maintained extraordinary influence through the 20th century. Remnants of the index's logic survived well into the 1980s. Priests warned congregations against reading certain political treatises. Bookstores in Buenos Aires were raided, not just by authoritarian governments, but by local bishops seeking to protect the faithful. In the Philippines, some Catholic universities quietly maintained blacklists of books, mirroring the index decades after it had been officially dissolved. And in parts of rural Italy, even in the early 2000s, villagers remembered that their grandparents kept certain books hidden in trunks, wrapped in cloth, stored in barns, not because they were illegal, but because once they had been. Fear has a long shelf life. What happens to a banned book once it's unbanned? Does it regain its voice? Or is it too late? In many cases, the removal of a book from the index did not result in its revival. Some remained unread, dusty, forgotten, stripped of the very infamy that once gave them life. But others bloomed anew. The works of Giordano Bruno, for example, whose ideas on cosmic pluralism and the infinite universe had once been labeled heretical, experienced a scholarly resurgence. Historians, astronomers, and philosophers began to reread his work not as science, not as theology, but as vision. Similarly, the once banned novels of writers like Émile Zola, Victor Hugo, and Gustave Flaubert gained fresh readers, now liberated from the shadow of disobedience. What had once been morally scandalous now seemed ordinary. Time does that. It softens fear. And yet, the spirit of the index lives on in strange places. Algorithms, for instance, now decide what ideas surface and what disappears. Bookstores may no longer burn pages, but they bury titles in search engines. A book can be drowned in obscurity without ever being banned. A single phrase flagged by a social platform can render an essay unreadable. Modern curation is subtler, but no less powerful, and sometimes it's even more so, because when censorship is invisible, it becomes indisputable. There is no list to challenge, no name to defy. Silence, quiet, compliant, and total in that sense. The index was almost honest. The final irony may be this: the Vatican Library, once the enforcer of banned ideas, is now one of the greatest preservers of forbidden texts in the world. If you are a qualified researcher, you can request to see first editions of nearly every book that ever made the index. Galileo's Dialogue, Kant's Critique, Rousseau's Emile, they are all there, and sometimes these once prohibited volumes are cleaner, better preserved, and more complete than editions found anywhere else. Because once a book was banned, it became the Vatican's responsibility to ensure that it didn't disappear entirely, like a hunter building a shrine to the wolves it once feared. The logic is circular, okay? But the result is preservation. So what were the final numbers? The last edition of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, published in 1948, listed over 4,000 individual titles. If you count multiple editions, authors, and categories, the number climbs to over 6,000. The books spanned centuries and continents, from scientific texts to plays, from novels to medical guides, from political theory to personal memoir. Even dictionaries were banned because sometimes the very act of naming something could be seen as rebellion. And in a strange twist, some books were banned simply because they questioned whether banning books was ever justified. This recursive anxiety defined much of the Church's relationship with knowledge. It feared ideas, but feared irrelevance more, so it read, cataloged, preserved, and, in doing so, the index became less a fire and more a mirror, a reflection of everything the Church could not contain. In the end, the index was never just a list. It was a worldview, a system of thought built on the belief that truth must be protected from itself, that the human mind, left to wander freely, would spiral into error. And so it built shelves, miles of them, quiet, heavy, unmoving. But the books were never still. And now that those shelves are open, the real question isn't what was forbidden, but rather, what are you still afraid to read? It was a crisp afternoon in 1609 when Galileo Galilei first turned his telescope toward the sky. He wasn't the first to create such an instrument, but he was among the first to use it in a revolutionary way. By then, the concept of a telescope was relatively new, and many had used it simply for terrestrial observation, scanning ships on the horizon or surveying faraway mountains. But Galileo, ever the inquisitive scholar, pointed his telescope upward. What he saw would forever alter humanity's perception of the universe. Galileo's discoveries weren't just technical marvels, they were theological challenges. Through his telescope, he confirmed that Jupiter had moons, the phases of Venus could be observed, and the rugged surface of the moon itself became visible for the first time. For centuries, scholars had believed that the heavens were perfect and unchanging, an idea rooted in ancient Greek and Christian thought. But Galileo's observations contradicted that. The moon was not a perfect sphere. The stars weren't fixed in place, and the planets, particularly Venus and Earth, were not in the immutable, perfect orbits that Ptolemy had once described. This was dangerous. You see, in the early 1600s, the dominant cosmological view endorsed by both the Church and most scholars was the Ptolemaic system, named after Claudius Ptolemy, an ancient Greek astronomer. This system placed Earth at the center of the universe. All the planets, including the Sun, revolved around the Earth. This view was widely accepted because it aligned with both biblical texts and long-standing religious tradition. But Galileo, through his telescope, had proven a new idea, the heliocentric model. The heliocentric theory, first proposed by Nicolaus Copernicus in 1543, suggested that the Earth revolved around the Sun. Copernicus had been deeply cautious with his theory, knowing the dangers of contradicting the established beliefs of the time. His work had initially been published posthumously and only in limited circles. But Galileo's observations made Copernicus' theory not just possible, but observable. And that was the problem. To accept the heliocentric model meant questioning not just astronomical facts, but the very order of the cosmos as established by the Church. The Sun was no longer the center of the universe. It was just another star. Earth, too, was no longer the center of God's creation. The human species was no longer the absolute focus of divine attention. In short, Galileo's findings presented a theological crisis. If God had placed Earth at the center of the universe, and now it seemed that Earth was just another planet orbiting the Sun, what did that say about human significance in the grand design of creation? And so, Galileo's discoveries didn't just threaten the scientific world, they threatened the very fabric of belief. In 1616, a year after Galileo had published his findings, the Catholic Church officially condemned the heliocentric theory. It was deemed heretical for contradicting the scriptures, particularly the Bible's assertion that the earth was immovable. The Church had been aware of Copernicus' work for decades, but it was Galileo's popularization of it that finally pushed the matter into the ecclesiastical spotlight. The Holy Office of the Inquisition issued an official ruling. Galileo's works were to be banned. His books were placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the list of forbidden books. The Church's decree was clear. Any assertion that the earth moved and the sun stood still was contrary to the word of God at the time. It seemed that the Church had the authority to silence such dissent. After all, this was the same Church that had led the Western world for over a millennium, a church that controlled not just religious matters, but intellectual ones as well. The Church could determine what was truth, and it determined with finality that Galileo's findings could not be allowed to stand unchallenged. This is where the story of Galileo's relationship with the Vatican begins to shift. In 1620, after the Church had condemned his works, Galileo was called to trial. It was not just the scientific community that had a stake in his findings, but the spiritual and political world. And so, Galileo stood before the Roman Catholic Inquisition, defending his observations and theories in a trial that would change his life forever. But there was a catch. Galileo wasn't formally charged with heresy. Instead, he was accused of vehement suspicion of heresy. It was a less serious charge, but one that carried its own weight. The Inquisition's focus was not so much on the truth of Galileo's ideas, but on the implications those ideas had for the established order. Galileo was forced to recant, but he didn't do so easily. The trial was a complex, personal affair. Galileo, a devout Catholic, didn't set out to defy the Church. He believed that his findings only enhanced the glory of God's creation. As he explained to his interrogators, his work was not in opposition to the scriptures. Rather, it was an attempt to better understand the divine order of the universe through scientific observation. Despite his protestations, Galileo was found guilty of teaching and writing in support of the heliocentric theory, which had been declared heretical. The punishment: house arrest for the remainder of his life. What followed was an ironic and tragic twist to Galileo's legacy. The Church's decision to punish him didn't stop the spread of his ideas. In fact, it only increased their appeal. Galileo's works were translated into numerous languages. They circulated far beyond Italy, reaching Protestant nations and intellectual circles throughout Europe. In the decades that followed, the Church continued to clamp down on the heliocentric theory, But the rise of modern science, led by thinkers like Johannes Kepler and Isaac Newton, slowly undermined the Church's position. By the time of Galileo's death in 1642, the heliocentric model was well on its way to becoming accepted scientific fact. The Vatican had tried to suppress it, but in doing so, had only guaranteed that his ideas would spread like wildfire. However, this is not the end of the story. Galileo's relationship with the Church did not remain hostile forever. In 1822, Pope Pius VII lifted the ban on Galileo's works, allowing them to be read publicly once again. In 1992, Pope John Paul II formally acknowledged the Church's error in condemning Galileo and issued a public apology. Yet even this apology doesn't quite resolve the complexity of the Church's relationship with Galileo's work. How could an institution so steadfastly uphold its own authority for centuries, only to later acknowledge that it had been wrong? Was it truly a change of heart, or was it simply a way to reclaim its relevance in the age of scientific progress? So, what did the Vatican truly write about the stars? The truth lies in the tension between faith and reason, between the sacred and the scientific. Galileo's discoveries were not just scientific, they were profoundly philosophical and theological. His work threatened to shift humanity's self-perception by casting doubt on Earth's centrality in the universe. He unknowingly questioned humanity's place in the divine order. But perhaps more than this, Galileo's experience with the Church reveals the limits of authority. The Church, in its quest to defend established doctrine, tried to silence a truth that was, in the end, undeniable. In the centuries since Galileo's trial, the Vatican's stance on science has evolved, but the scars of the battle between religion and reason remain. The story of Galileo is not just about a man who fought to defend the truth of the cosmos, but about the struggle between certainty and doubt, a struggle that continues to shape humanity's understanding of the universe today. As we look toward the stars, it's impossible not to wonder what else is still hidden. What other truths are waiting to be discovered, even if they challenge everything we've ever believed. It was not common for a pope to spend hours alone in the library, not even in the Renaissance, when scholarship was fashionable and erudition was a sign of divine order. Most pontiffs had secretaries, scholars, or scribes to do the reading for them, but Pope Pius II, born Ennio Silvio Piccolomini, had never really stopped being a writer. Even after the white robes replaced his ink-stained scholar's sleeves, he had a fondness for solitude, for old parchment, for the crisp logic of Latin unfolding across vellum like footsteps echoing in a marble corridor. And it was there, in the innermost sanctum of the Vatican's ancient shelves, that he stumbled upon a document no one expected a pope to read. It was not heretical, not dangerous in the usual sense, but it contained a theory so strange, so mathematically precise, and yet so threatening to the neat celestial hierarchy the Church had preserved, that even speaking of it could raise eyebrows. It had been brought to Rome by a Jewish physician fleeing persecution in Iberia, copy of an even older Arabic text, which itself had been translated from a Greek original, long since lost. The text described a model of the solar system, not with Earth at its center, but the sun. It was not Copernicus, of course. This was still a century before the revolution about Orbium Coelestium, but it echoed a similar intuition that if one allowed for a moving Earth and a stationary sun, many of the astronomical tables, especially those tracking the retrograde motion of planets, suddenly became simpler, cleaner. The document had been hidden, not destroyed. It's filed away in a folder labeled simply Spheris Incertus on the uncertain spheres. It had not been read in decades. It wasn't even fully translated. Scattering of Latin notes, a diagram, a list of corrections. Pius II read it quietly, then sat still for a long time. There are no records of what he said afterward. But 2 days later, he ordered a personal, handwritten copy to be made and shelved under a false title. This was not the only time the Vatican shelves absorbed something the public world could not. Over time, the archive became less a vault and more a sponge soaking in banned texts, sanctioned observations, stray correspondences, and political confessions, especially confessions. The second section of the secret archive, quailing, called the Corridor of Silences, held bundles of letters never meant for public eyes. Some were written in times of fear, nobles begging for clemency, kings offering alliances, heretics seeking understanding. Others were quieter letters between cardinals, written in cautious tone, sometimes using code. There were also medical records, horoscopes drawn by court astrologers, and private notes exchanged between popes and scientists. Perhaps most curious were the files labeled simply oblatio. The Latin term means offering, but in these documents it signified something else entirely: intellectual surrender. Monks, scholars, even bishops had submitted letters confessing ideas they feared were unorthodox. Not to be punished, but to be understood. They offered up their doubts like altar sacrifices. In return, they hoped for silence. One such letter came from a 14th century Benedictine monk named Theodoricus Tias, who had written a treatise on the physics of sound. He had constructed rudimentary experiments using hollow reeds, water levels, and clay spheres to measure how far a whisper could travel in a chapel. His conclusion, radical for the time, was that sound moved in waves, not instantaneously. He feared this might contradict church teachings about angelic speech, which was believed to be instantaneous, divine, and unbound by physics. Theodoricus offered up his manuscript to Rome with a quiet plea: "If it is the Lord's will that I am wrong, let it not be read. But if I am not wrong, let it rest until it is no longer dangerous." The Vatican archivists accepted the work. They shelved it. It was never published, never condemned, just stored, precisely as he had requested, where it remains to this day. These are the stories that live in the cracks between shelves, in the places where forbidden becomes forgotten, and forgotten becomes sacred in its own quiet way. It was also during the late 16th century that the Vatican began storing correspondences with distant landsletters from emperors in China, from Orthodox patriarchs in Russia, and from early explorers describing encounters in the Americas. Many of these letters were filled with exaggeration. Some were barely legible, but the Vatican kept them all, organizing them meticulously, often with marginal notes questioning the truth of their claims. One particularly intriguing folder, dated 1583, contains a letter from an Italian Jesuit named Alessandro Valignano, who had traveled to Japan and was writing back to the Vatican about a peculiar debate among local Buddhist monks. The monks, he wrote, believed the soul did not enter the body at conception, but only after birth. Valignano was disturbed, not only by the idea, but by how well it was argued. He asked the Vatican to send scholars who could debate the monks, respectfully an unusual request at the time. Instead of sending anyone, the church simply shelved the letter, and then forgot about it. When the letter was found again in 1911, it still carried Valignano's closing words: "If we cannot persuade them, we must at least understand why they think as they do." That phrase echoed strangely through the corridors of the archive, because understanding, though never condemned, was rarely the church's first instinct. And yet, over and over again, in dusty folders and silent manuscripts, we find evidence that some part of the church always wanted to know, even if knowing meant silence. Not all items in the archive were paper. Some were objects. There was, for example, a worn astrolabe retrieved from a Franciscan mission in Tunis, engraved with Arabic numerals and brass etchings of the stars, a small brass sphere from a Chinese observatory, a wax cylinder that may or may not have once held a confession recorded in the earliest days of sound technology, though it's so degraded now that no one can tell. And then there are the things listed but never found. One inventory from 1843 refers cryptically to a sealed scroll in undeciphered writing, believed to be neither Hebrew nor Greek. It was supposedly found inside a reliquary in the catacombs beneath St. Peter's and given to a visiting scholar from Sweden. No trace of it remains. Another inventory references a book called Liber Imaginum Coelestium. It's a book of celestial images, which reportedly contained diagrams of the heavens based not on the Church's official cosmology, but on ancient Egyptian star maps. The book was supposedly withdrawn in 1751. It hasn't been seen since Dada. And then there are the ciphers. Some letters, especially from the 17th and 18th centuries, are written in code. Some of these codes have been broken. Others remain puzzles. One entire folder of documents from the reign of Pope Innocent XI is labeled Scripta Obscura, Dark Writings. It is believed to include communication between the Vatican and underground resistance groups in Protestant territories. The documents are not classified. They are not even especially controversial, but they remain untranslated because no one knows the cipher. It is this combination, the known and the unknowable, that gives the archive its strange weight. Not the scandal, not the drama, but the persistent hum of unanswered questions. The Vatican Archive is less a museum than a suspension of time, a place where documents are neither erased nor released, where doubt is folded in cloth and sealed with wax. And yet, you can't help but wonder how many other discoveries, like the solar model Pius II read, remain hidden in plain sight. How many monks, like Theodoricus, chose to be quiet, not out of fear, but out of faith that one day someone would be ready to understand. What happens to truth when it is neither silenced nor shared, but simply filed away, filed away? There is a corridor within the Vatican's archives that does not appear on the public floor plans. It isn't hidden behind secret doors, nor shrouded in dramatic silence. In fact, if you walk past it quickly, it looks like nothing at all, just another row of tall, narrow shelving. But its oddity lies in its label, Index Non-Catalogatus, the uncatalogued index. Most sections of the Vatican's archive are sorted with a military precision. Latin titles, dating systems, leather-bound folios lined in neat chronological progression. But this one defies the pattern. The Index Non-Catalogatus contains documents that were never properly entered into any official inventory. They were shelved when their relevance wasn't clear, or when their danger outweighed their utility. They are the Vatican's equivalent of unsolved cases, a kind of clerical purgatory. For centuries, the few archivists granted access to this index worked with gloves, low light, and meticulous care. Not because the materials were especially fragile, because many bore traces of decisions no pope ever wanted to make public. A decree drafted but never signed. A list of names struck through but never erased. Even minutes from internal inquiries. That ended in silence. One document, yellowed and cracked along the edges, bore the title To Circulus Herbarum. On the surface, it seemed to be a treatise on medicinal plants, written in elegant Renaissance Latin, but folded within it were several pages, a different hand, outlining something far more curious, a geometry of herbal combinations believed to induce visions. The annotations suggested it had been copied from a now-lost text brought back from the Himalayas by an anonymous Jesuit in the 1600s. The Church did not destroy the manuscript, nor did it translate it fully. It simply added a note, inutile ad fidem, useless to the faith, and yet they kept it. Elsewhere in the same corridor lies a letter with no date, no address, and no signature, only a wax seal bearing a broken fish design. The content of the letter is brief. It discusses a strange device found during excavations in the Roman catacombs, which appeared to be a set of rotating bronze rings etched with inscriptions. The letter notes that it spins when left in sunlight and speculates, without conclusion, that it may be a kind of calendar. But the church never followed up. The device was allegedly stored. The letter was filed. That was the end of it. And it is in these half-finished stories, these abandoned threads, that we begin to understand the true nature of the Vatican's forgotten archive. It is not simply a vault of forbidden knowledge. It is a living museum of indecision, where doubt, uncertainty, and the slow, uncomfortable growth of thought are preserved, not erased. Even within the more formal sections of the archive, the records of papal investigations reveal how knowledge was often weighed, not on truth, but on risk. Consider the case of Father Paolo Sarpi, a Venetian scholar and theologian who corresponded extensively with mathematicians and astronomers across Europe. In one of the vault's sealed files, there are copies of letters he received from Galileo Letters, in which the astronomer tried to reconcile his observations with church teaching. The archive contains Sarpi's response. 2. Not a challenge, but a warning. The eye may see what the mind cannot yet afford to believe, he wrote. So let the seeing be silent, and let the believing wait. Another file, stamped with the insignia of Pope Urban VIII, contains marginal notes about the Council of Trent, not the grand decrees that emerged, but the behind-the-scenes debates that shaped them. One transcript, barely legible, courts a discussion between cardinals on whether books written by Lutherans should be burned or hidden. The verdict, curiously, was not uniform. Several bishops argued for silent preservation, fearing that to burn the books would also burn the questions they had not yet dared to answer. It is from these half-whispered decisions and shelved uncertainties that the Vatican's shelves gained their peculiar gravity, not because they housed definitive truths, but because they preserved the moments when truth was still being negotiated. Take, for example, the obscure case of the Calendarium Ethiopicae 15th century manuscript that arrived in Rome through a Jesuit exchange in East Africa. It was a calendar, yes, but unlike any in Europe. The year began in September. The months were 30 days each, with 5 epigomenal days added at the end. But what disturbed some scholars was that the calendar also included liturgical feasts for figures unknown to the Roman Church Christian martyrs, whose names did not appear in any known Latin texts. Instead of discarding the document, the Vatican created a quiet committee to investigate. The group never reached consensus. Some members believed the calendar revealed a valid Christian tradition unrecorded in Europe. Others feared it might encourage pluralism. In the end, this calendar was copied, filed, and not mentioned again until it resurfaced centuries later during ecumenical dialogues in the 20th century. Then there's the question of the popes themselves, their personal diaries, letters, and confessions. Contrary to popular belief, not all papal writings are public. Many are archived in personal collections, often restricted for 70 to 100 years after the Pope's death. Some contain theological musings, others admissions of failure. The diary of Pope Benedict XIV, for instance, contains long entries on his struggle to reconcile scientific findings with Catholic dogma. One line reads, "If the bones of the earth are older than Adam, what then was Adam?" It's a simple question. No answer given. Benedict XIV also kept a list, never published, of books he believed the Church should one day embrace. Among them, works by Muslim astronomers, Jewish mystics, and Chinese philosophers. The list ends with a sentence that echoes eerily down the centuries. The truth is not afraid of being read. This is the essence of the archive. It listens, even when it does not speak. It waits, even when it cannot decide. During the Napoleonic Wars, much of the Vatican's archive was seized and transported to Paris. When it was returned, decades later, Several documents were missing, but others had been added. French archivists, intrigued by the breadth of the collection, had slipped in their own copies of controversial texts, Voltaire's letters to bishops, Rousseau's essays annotated by clergy, even royal court documents smuggled out of Vienna. Instead of rejecting these intrusions, the Vatican absorbed them, cataloged them, filed them under cross-referenced titles. One document, a scathing critique of papal infallibility, was placed next to a defense of it, creating a quiet debate that only the most curious scholars would ever notice. And this, perhaps, is the final, most unexpected truth of the Vatican's 53 miles of shelves. They are not a prison for knowledge, nor are they a sanctuary. They are a forum silent, sprawling, indirect, where the Church has preserved not only its decisions, but also its indecisions. What do you call a place where contradictions are preserved, not erased? Where a pope can read a forbidden theory and quietly shelve it. Where monks record their doubts, emperors send their lies, and scientists whisper through footnotes. You might call it an archive, but it is also a mirror of everything the Church was afraid to say, and everything it secretly hoped might one day be understood. And as you walk past its endless shelves, stacked with years the world has forgotten, you cannot help but wonder, what, right now, is being shelved for the future? What thought, what theory, what inconvenient truth is resting, sealed among these endless rows? What secret waits for a time when it is no longer dangerous to know, in the quietest corners of history, where the shadows of parchment cling to the scent of mildew and wax? A map lies folded, too carefully to have been forgotten, too meticulously drawn to have been discarded. It was never printed, never sold, never even named in the great atlases of the Renaissance. And yet, it was drawn with precision, recorded in ink that has not faded, and in a hand that belonged to a man both celebrated and then swiftly erased. His name was Fra Mauro, a Camaldolese monk of the 15th century, living in the San Michele monastery on the island of Murano, just across the Venetian lagoon. He had never sailed across the open sea. He had never stepped foot beyond the Adriatic, and yet he became the cartographer of the world. He was, by all accounts, a man of habit. He woke at the bells, copied scripture by candlelight, and took his meals in the same silence as his fellow monks. But unlike most of them, Mauro had an obsession, the shape of the world, and not the mystical allegories of the earth as a divine orb, or the symbolic division into the realms of paradise, purgatory, and damnation. Mauro wanted the world as it was. He wanted to draw what existed, even if it contradicted what the Church had taught by the 1440s. His fame had begun to reach beyond Venice. Merchants from Lisbon, diplomats from Cairo, and even explorers from India, they had begun to pass through Murano, not just for its glass, but for Mauro's mind. They brought stories, sketches, rumors of rivers no monk had seen, and cities no scripture had ever named. And Fra Mauro wrote it all down, in long notes on loose vellum, in sketches on the backs of letters, in margins that curled like waves around theological texts. Then came the commission. It arrived quietly, with no fanfare, a request from King Afonso V of Portugal, relayed through the Venetian state. Would Fra Mauro, the monk who knew the shape of lands he'd never walked, create a full map of the world for the royal court? Mauro agreed, but he made a condition. The map would not be censored. He would record what travelers told him, what Arab maps had shown, what Indian sailors whispered over wine, even if those details did not fit the sacred geography of medieval Europe. The Venetian authorities were hesitant. After all, church maps were meant to reflect God's order. Jerusalem at the center, East at the top, the world shaped more by faith than fact. But Moro was persuasive, and perhaps more importantly, he was accurate. For 3 years, Fra Moro worked. He consulted with sailors and scholars. He translated documents in Greek, Arabic, and Latin. He cross-referenced charts brought by Genoese merchants and fragments of older Ptolemaic maps. And in his cell, under oil lamps that flickered through the night, he drew, with black ink and red outlines, with blue rivers curling like veins and mountains rising like bone ridges beneath the parchment skin. When he was finished, the map was unlike anything Europe had seen. It was circular, yes, but rotated south at the top. Decision based on Arabic navigational standards, not religious doctrine. The world sprawled outward from a center that was not Jerusalem, but somewhere near the Nile. Africa was vast, its interior laced with rivers and cities. India was detailed, its coasts precise, its ports marked with the notes of ship captains, and across the Eastern Ocean's islands that no European had yet reached, but which Moro included with careful annotations. He labeled the Indian Ocean as navigable. He described lands beyond the known, not as mythical places of monsters, or Eden, but as territories occupied by real people. Some of his notes contradicted Catholic geography. Others hinted at trade networks that outmatched anything Europe yet possessed. But most scandalous of all was a narrow line, barely thicker than a hair, drawn from the southern tip of Africa, curving westward, cited in Moro's crisp Latin, were words that chilled the faithful. There is a route around Africa to the sea beyond. At the time, this was theory, a heresy of logic, not theology. The Church maintained that such waters might exist, but were impassable, unnatural, perhaps even forbidden. Moro had charted it clearly, as if it were a matter of fact. The map, upon completion, was boxed in a crate of cedar wood and carried by diplomatic envoy toward Lisbon. And yet, along the way, a copy was made, quietly, secretly, for the archives of the Vatican. It is this copy, fragile, faded, rarely shown, that still rests somewhere within the locked wings of the Vatican Apostolic Archive. But why hide it? The Church's official position at the time was cautious neutrality. Maps were not heretical in themselves, but they became dangerous when they undermined doctrine. For maps suggested, for example, that paradise was not east of Eden, or worse, that it did not appear on any continent. It cast doubt on Scripture. If a map included lands never mentioned in holy texts, it suggested a world too vast for the Church to control. Fra Moro's map did both, and so, even as the Portuguese king praised the chart and explorers began to plan their routes around Africa, the Vatican quietly filed their copy away. It was never displayed in full, never translated into the Vatican's official atlas, and for centuries, Moro's work remained something of a whispered legend, a map that knew too much, too soon. Meanwhile, Fra Moro continued his monastic duties. He never saw the consequences of his map unfold, never saw Vasco da Gama complete the journey around Africa decades later, never saw how his quiet lines on parchment would redraw the entire course of global trade and colonization. He died in his cell, surrounded by vellum and ink, and in the centuries that followed, other cartographers copied parts of his work, but none with the same quiet defiance, none with the same subtle rejection of a world centered around one faith. And so, you wonder, why did the Church hide the map? Was it fear? Is it the unsettling realization that divine maps and earthly maps might not match? Or was it something deeper? The knowledge that control over land was nothing compared to control over truth. A map, after all, is not just geography. It is permission to explore, to question, to believe differently. And if that permission is too boldly given, too widely shared, perhaps it is safer to fold the map, to slide it onto a high shelf, to pretend it was never drawn at all, at all. It is early morning in Rome. sometime in the middle of the 17th century, the kind of morning where ink clings to the tip of a quill a little more slowly, and the wax on the seal of an envelope takes a little longer to harden. In a side chamber of the Vatican Library, down a corridor few were permitted to walk, and even fewer dared to speak about, sat a man named Giovanni Battista Riccioli. Riccioli was not a rebel in the usual sense. He did not shout in the streets, nor pen manifestos calling for the end of papal authority. He did not even consider himself at odds with the church. Not truly. Yet his work and the maps that silently accompanied it posed quiet, persistent questions, the sort of questions that made archivists nervous and some cardinals whisper when they thought no one could hear. He was a Jesuit priest, a scientist, and an astronomer. And as strange as it might sound, it was not the stars that got Riccioli into trouble. It was the land, or more precisely, the shape of the land as seen from high above, and how it was beginning to contradict things that had, for centuries, been assumed as truth. It had started with coastlines, seemingly harmless endeavor. Riccioli and his contemporaries had been comparing older maps with newer ones, often acquired from Dutch and Portuguese navigators. These were men who had actually sailed the routes they described, their margins smudged with sea salt and their ink faded from sun exposure. They were not theologians. They were not concerned with whether a particular island existed in the eyes of doctrine. They simply drew what they saw, and what they saw was ... Different island chains, once believed to be figments of medieval exaggeration, were appearing with consistency on multiple navigators' charts. The mythical St. Brendan's Island was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, a crescent-shaped reef in the South Pacific, unnamed, unremarkable, was appearing on so many separate maps that Riccioli began to suspect it had never been discovered at all. It had always been there, merely ignored by older ecclesiastical sources. The trouble deepened when these geographical inconsistencies began to impact biblical geography. Take, for instance, the location of Ophir, the ancient source of King Solomon's gold, is traditionally placed somewhere along the Arabian Peninsula. Riccioli's reinterpreted maps, cross-referenced with maritime records, seemed to suggest it could have been somewhere near the east coast of Africa, perhaps even beyond. This was not just a cartographic matter. If the locations referenced in Scripture were wrong, if the world drawn by the medieval church had been overly symbolic, then how many of its interpretations could be trusted? Riccioli never asked these questions aloud. He merely charted. He recorded. He revised. But even in silence, ink can be dangerous. By 1650, a quiet revolt was underway, not in the streets of Rome, but in the basements of its libraries and the unlit offices of monastic cartographers. More and more priests trained in natural philosophy began requesting access to Portolan charts, detailed coastal maps used by sailors, often adorned with wind, roses, and drawn on sheepskin. These were practical tools, not theological ones, but their precision was threatening. They showed a world in motion, not one created and sealed long ago. Within the Vatican, a subtle divide began to form. There were those who believed that geography must support doctrine, that the boundaries of the earth had been divinely ordained and thus could not shift. And then there were others, quieter but growing in number, who believed that to chart the truth of the world was not an act of defiance, but a form of worship. One of them was a man named Niccolo Alibrandi, an assistant cartographer with no title and very little influence. He worked in the margins of the map room, repairing old parchments and translating Arabic annotations brought back by traders. His days were long and unremarkable, but one evening in the autumn of 1656, Alibrandi stayed late. A shipment of charts had arrived from Venice. Tucked between two routine naval records was something unusual. It was a map of South America, not unusual in itself, but this one showed the Amazon River far more accurately than any in the Vatican's archives. It included tributaries that no church map had ever acknowledged, along with an unfamiliar mark labeled Provincia de los Hombres Altos, province of the tall men. This was not myth. The mapmaker had noted weather patterns, trade goods, and distances in units that matched known Portuguese measures. It was not the work of a fantasist, and that made it far more problematic. Alibrandi did not report the find. He carefully copied the map by candlelight, annotated it in Latin, and stored it beneath a stack of to-be-verified parchments. Then he requested access to all previous charts of the Amazon region, ostensibly to compare ink types. For the next 6 months, he documented every inconsistency, every adjustment, every omission. And what he found was that with each new map submitted by explorers, the Vatican's approved version had changed, not to match reality, but to preserve a consistent theological frame. Entire mountain ranges had been ignored. Cities had been renamed to match biblical echoes, and coastlines had been bent subtly to conform to symbolic interpretations. None of this surprised Riccioli when Alibrandi quietly brought him his findings. The older Jesuit listened without interruption, merely nodding from time to time. When the younger man finished, Riccioli spoke only a few words. Put it in the index. The index, in this case, was not the famous Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the official list of prohibited books. It was something much quieter, a drawer in Riccioli's desk, locked with a simple brass key. Inside it, maps, dozens of them, charts that did not conform, records that were too accurate, knowledge that was too real to be seen. Riccioli was not trying to suppress the truth. He believed it needed to be preserved, but in silence, till the time was right. Others were not so careful. In 1660, a German Jesuit named Christoph Scheiner attempted to publish a revised map of the world based on telescopic measurements and newly translated Arabic sources. His map showed Mecca with unprecedented precision and placed biblical Tarshish far outside the traditionally accepted zones. Though he released the map under a pseudonym, Vatican's archivists quickly traced it back to him. He was summoned, reprimanded, and sent to a quiet post in the Bavarian countryside. His maps were seized. Some were quietly burned, others disappeared, and yet the shelves kept growing. By the end of the 17th century, the Vatican Library contained over 30,000 maps and atlases. Many were routine, but among them, locked in boxes marked non consultabile, were records of a world that contradicted the world of doctrine, a quieter geography that had been mapped, measured, and shelved. For every map on display, there were others hidden. And slowly, a new cartographic discipline was emerging, one defined not by the lands it charted, but by the silences it maintained. What happens then, when a map tells a truth its creators are not ready to see? By the dawn of the 18th century, the halls of the Vatican Library had grown heavier, not in appearance, but in feeling. More than just scrolls and illuminated manuscripts, the shelves now held a silent tension, the weight of knowledge, carefully recorded but never shown, of ink that had been allowed to dry but never breathe. The cartographic revolution had not come all at once. There was no singular map that challenged the authority of the papal worldview, no burning declaration, no manifesto unfurled in the public square. Instead, there had been a slow accumulation of quiet deviations. One map placing a river too far west, another describing a port the church hadn't acknowledged, a third including islands supposedly undiscovered for centuries. The Vatican's geographers didn't deny these discoveries outright. They simply moved them into special storage, the non-consultabile section, where records went to wait. There, dustless drawers and fireproof cabinets, lay the quiet rebellion of knowledge. The maps did not shout, they whispered. But even whispers, in time, accumulate. In the early 1700s, the archivists began a new project, cataloging the entire collection of restricted cartographic works. The task was assigned to a Jesuit named Matteo Vincenzo Barbarigo. He was not particularly ambitious. He was, in fact, the kind of man most suited to such a task, patient, meticulous, and content to work in silence. Barbarigo approached his assignment with the quiet reverence of a monk polishing brass candlesticks, one chart at a time, one annotation after another. And yet, even in his methodical pace, a pattern began to emerge, one that was hard to ignore. Each shelved map had a reason for its obscurity. Some bore foreign languages, deemed suspicious Ottoman calligraphy, Persian annotations, or Chinese watermarks. Others had been flagged for theological reasons. They contradicted biblical geography. They omitted sacred sites, or they included pagan symbols in decorative cartouches. But the most curious were the ones marked only with the code. Non-conform, ration mysteria, not conforming due to the mystery. Barbarigo did not understand what mystery they referred to. No explanation was ever provided. It's only a series of coordinates, a date, and a scribe's initials. And yet, the label appeared again and again on charts from Portugal, from Mughal, India, from forgotten Jesuit missions in Central Asia. There was no political consistency, no theological thread. The only shared trait seemed to be uncertainty. These were maps that presented features too early, too advanced, or simply too inconvenient. One such example was a map copied in Goa in 1603, showing the precise latitude of a temple ruin in Tibet, a site that European explorers were not believed to have reached until the 19th century. Another was a chart of the Western Sahara with irrigation canals that matched ancient Roman systems, systems thought to have vanished without a trace. Then still another, hand-drawn on rice paper, showed the coastline of Australia a century before it was formally discovered. Barbarigo did not draw conclusions. He did not argue. He merely copied each entry, wrote his observations, and placed the maps back into their drawers. But his catalog, once completed, was quietly filed under internal archival only. It was never printed. It was never cited. It was shelved in a room with no label. In time, it, too, became a mystery. Centuries passed, empires rose and fell. The world became measurable in new ways: satellites, photography, digital cartography. But still, the Vatican's map room remained one of the most meticulously maintained cartographic archives in the world. Visitors were allowed, yes, but only in the outer chambers, only where the maps had been vetted. What no visitor saw were the unframed scrolls stacked like quiet confessions, charts without compasses, atlases with missing legends, maritime records sealed with the insignia of explorers who would never publicly acknowledged. The Vatican shelves did not deny the world. They simply edited it. In the 20th century, its political alliances shifted, and the Church began opening more of its archives to scholars. Some of these maps began to surface. A few made their way into academic studies, stripped of their origin. Others were reinterpreted as symbolic or incomplete representations. But a handful of researchers, quiet and careful, began to ask deeper questions. One such scholar was Maria Koenig, an Austrian geographer, fluent in Latin and Arabic. She had obtained access to several of the less restricted Jesuit maps from the 17th century and noticed something odd. Many of them shared certain symbols, small and unobtrusive, located not in the margins, but within the body of the maps themselves. A spiral here, a crescent there, a pattern of dots encircling what appeared to be ordinary towns. Koenig, skeptical of conspiracies, dismissed these as decorative until she found a reference in an old Jesuit ledger. E.T. Hic, sub signo spirale, locus veritatis est. And here, beneath the spiral symbol, is the place of truth. What truth? No one knew. When she petitioned for access to the full Barbarigo catalog, she was denied, with no explanation. The record, she was told, was classified under ecclesiastical protection. No copies had been made, but Cornick had touched something, not a revelation, but a residue, the outline of a deeper cartographic story, one that had passed quietly from scribe to scribe, not to deceive, but to protect. These were not maps meant to be forgotten. They were maps meant to wait. So, what were they waiting for? That question brings us to today. The Vatican Library now stretches over 53 miles of shelving, much of it underground. Scholars from around the world visit its outer chambers, poring over ancient manuscripts, Bibles, and codices. Some maps have been digitized. Others remain in acid-free boxes, unscanned in Unix, AMINED. And deep within that maze of knowledge lies the map room, guarded, quiet, filled with the scent of paper, ink, and the faintest whisper of time. We may never know what lies in the drawers marked non-conform, ration, mysteria. We may never decode the true purpose of those quiet spirals, those misplaced rivers, those coastal outlines that defy chronology. But sometimes history is not about certainty. Sometimes it is about silence, about what was too fragile to say aloud and too important to destroy. Perhaps the real map is not geographic at all. Perhaps it is the path of questions that were never allowed to be asked. And in that quiet, endless corridor beneath the Vatican, those questions are still waiting for someone willing to read the world as it was, not as it was told to be. Before we begin, gently settle in, wherever you're listening from, be it beneath warm covers, beside a low-lit desk, or on a quiet evening walk. Take a moment to notice the time. The world continues on outside, but here, in this soft place of stories, we're going backward into the dusty corridors of history, where ink once spoke truths and then quietly disappeared. Let's step carefully through the corridors of the Vatican's Apostolic Archives, once known as the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. It's a name that evokes mystery, but secretum, in this sense, never meant secret as in hidden from the world. It meant private. It was the Pope's private library. And yet, for centuries, its contents were indeed kept from the eyes of the public, the scholarly, and even many clerics themselves. Among the 53 miles of shelving that wrap around the underbelly of the Vatican lie tens of thousands of documents that have barely seen the light of scholarly day. Many of these are mundane, correspondence, receipts, land deeds, but buried between them, sometimes mislabeled, sometimes bundled with irrelevant parchment, are manuscripts that hint at an unsettling loss, the disappearance of early scientific thought. Somewhere within those shelves is a shadowed legacy of scholars whose names we've forgotten. There are whispers in the historical record of astronomical treatises from Islamic Spain that were copied into Latin but never published. Letters describing anatomical experiments that predated Vesalius by decades. Theories of motion scrawled in friar's Latin that eerily anticipate Newton's laws long before Newton himself was born. We begin with a curious discovery made not in Rome, but in Bologna. In 1921, a Dominican archivist named Father Pietro Ugolini was sorting through a collection of medieval canon law when he came upon something strange. Sandwiched between two legal treatises from the 13th century was a sheaf of pages written in a different hand, using a mix of Latin and early Italian. The handwriting was that of a scientist, not a theologian. It was a messy, restless hand. The margins were filled with corrections and diagrams. Ugolini, curious, took the bundle to his superior. What they had uncovered was a commentary on optics, not optics in the theological sense, not the metaphor of divine light, but literal optics, light rays, lenses, refraction, angles, and diagrams of something that looked very much like a concave mirror, focusing light on a point. Some passages described an experiment in which sunlight was channeled through cut crystal, causing a piece of wood to blacken. Primitive as it sounds, it echoed the principles behind the burning lenses and early solar experiments that wouldn't become common knowledge till centuries later. The manuscript was unsigned, but there was a name smudged on the back of one folio, Jacobus Fornari. That name appears in no major list of scientists. No university roll calls from the era, no ecclesiastical censuses, but it does appear faintly in a tax record from 1283, which lists a Jacobus Fornari living in Lucca and exempted from guild fees due to ecclesiastical patronage. Was he a clerical scholar with a fascination for light, or merely a scribe? The answer was never discovered, because soon after Ugolini reported the find, the manuscript was removed from his custody. The Vatican Archives acknowledged receiving it, but decades later, when researchers requested access, they were told no such document was cataloged under that name. It had vanished. Now, let's return to Rome, where a Jesuit named Giuseppe Calvi, in the 1930s, was tasked with preparing parts of the archive for limited academic access. As part of that initiative, he reviewed old indexes written in the 1600s by a Papal librarian named Lucas Holstenius. One particular entry caught Calvi's eye: Tractatus de corpore humano, cum figurex Calino, translatum, et. Elise additamentus mechanicis, Keenus, on the human body, with figures translated from Galen, with additional mechanical notes. This line seemed simple. Perhaps it was merely another commentary on Galenic medicine. But Tolstoy had added a peculiar footnote: additamenta insolita, de instrumentis incisi, unusual additions about cutting instruments. Calvi followed the index number, traced it to a shelf, only to find that the bundle had been replaced with a 17th century copy of a sermon. The original Tractatus was gone. Some say it was lost in a reshuffling of the archives. Others quietly speculate it may have contained illustrations or ideas that church authorities had deemed inappropriate for wider dissemination. After all, the Catholic Church's stance on anatomical dissection had always been uneasy. In the early Middle Ages, the human body was treated with deep reverence. Dissection, though practiced, was frowned upon in many quarters, but a growing number of scholars believed that these vanished manuscripts, from optical experiments to anatomical commentaries, point not to a conspiracy of suppression, but to a tragedy of misfiling, mislabeling, and neglect. The Vatican Archives, for much of their history, were not managed with modern archival standards. For centuries, documents were bundled by type, by pope, or by occasion. A theological letter might share a folder with a laundry receipt. A scientific treatise might be tucked in with canon law simply because both were copied on the same kind of parchment. Add to this the fact that many manuscripts were written in unstable ink, on degrading paper, or recopied by scribes unfamiliar with the terminology. Errors crept in, titles were abbreviated, whole works were misattributed. Still, doesn't explain the persistent thread of stories that speak of early inventions and the Church's discomfort with them in 1939. Just before the outbreak of World War II, the Vatican undertook a quiet reorganization of certain sections of the archive. Several bundles were removed. One was labeled Instrumenta Mirabilis. Another bore the name De Vita Celeste. Jesuit historian Father Henry Masson wrote in his private notes that he saw a document describing a device for measuring the hour by shadow without the sun, a clock without sunlight. He copied only a few lines before the papers were reclaimed by superiors. He wrote in his journal, "I do not know if what I saw was from the East or from our own inventors long forgotten, but it felt like the echo of something we once knew, then chose to forget." What Masson had seen may have been a description of a water clock, or an early mechanical escapement, or something altogether different. But the sense of regret in his words mirrors that of other scholars who stumbled upon tantalizing clues, only to watch them vanish behind institutional caution or inertia in later years. Digitization has brought hope. The Vatican began scanning thousands of documents in the 21st century. Yet only a fraction of the full archive is available online. And many of the misfiled, misnamed, or unindexed works remain buried, sometimes within folders labeled only miscellanea. Some historians argue that the Vatican's caution is understandable. It is not a research library, they say, but a working institution with centuries of overlapping bureaucracy. The archives were never meant to serve public curiosity. Others insist that access to knowledge, however mundane or outdated, must be protected from loss. Perhaps the most haunting reality isn't that the Church suppressed science, but that we may never know what we once knew. What if there was a monk who sketched a pendulum before Galileo, a friar who traced blood vessels and guessed its circulation before Harvey, a cleric who experimented with light, not to challenge the Church, but to better understand God's creation? And what if their words now sleep quietly, tucked between receipts and letters, waiting to be found again, If you're still with me, let your thoughts slow further. Think of old paper, how it smells when it's forgotten. It's that dry, fibrous scent, the slight curl at the edges of time. Think of a dark corridor, lined with volumes that no one has touched in hundreds of years. Dust clinging to the air. One breath in, and you're already part of history. We now turn to the Jesuits, a society as famous for their missionary zeal as for their meticulous record-keeping. It was often the Jesuits who ventured furthest into the unknown, into South American jungles, into the Chinese imperial court, into the mountains of Tibet. But they were not just priests, cartographers, astronomers, engineers. They believed that the study of creation glorified the Creator. And so, they wrote, by the 17th century, their reach had spread across continents. But their central archive, where reports, experiments, and observations were sent, remained close to the Vatican, in rooms not always marked on official blueprints. Jesuit scholars cataloged everything from the movement of constellations over Paraguay to the properties of strange ores gathered in the Andes. One such document, known only as Codex 314J, was referenced in the 1804 notes of Father Theodor Kessel, a German Jesuit who cataloged the Society's scientific holdings before the order was suppressed in many parts of Europe. The Codex, he noted, contained annotations on self-moving gears and perpetual oscillators, including diagrams. He described one drawing in particular, a suspended arm that used the flow of water to regulate a copper weight, which then triggered a gear. The device was claimed to measure time, even without shadow or flame. Again, strange phrase, a clock that worked without sundials or candles. Father Kessel's reference was clear and methodical, but by 1850, when another Jesuit attempted to locate Codex 314J, it was no longer where Kessel said it had been. The room itself had been reassigned. The Codex was likely placed into a bundle labeled Notes on Mechanica Var, a category that now contains hundreds of items. Many college, and here's where it becomes quietly tragic. In the 19th century, during Napoleon's seizure of Rome and the brief occupation of the Papal States, many Vatican documents were moved, some looted, others boxed and hidden. We know that portions of the Apostolic Archives were taken to Paris. When they were returned years later, a portion was missing. Some say French scholars quietly kept anything that wasn't directly theological. Others believe the chaos of retransport simply lost dozens of trunks. One Italian historian, Luciano Balestri, wrote in 1908 that an entire portfolio of scientific tracts, mostly Latin, bearing Jesuit seals, had gone missing in the 1820s, possibly stored in the same cart as PayPal diplomatic letters. It is possible that those missing papers included Codex 314J or others like it. But what were these tracts, really? Let's move cautiously through the fog of speculation and return to what we can know. The Jesuits, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, were pioneers in translating Eastern mathematics and astronomy into European frameworks. Their missions in China, for instance, brought them into contact with sophisticated lunar calendars and complex mechanical devices, including celestial globes and armillary spheres. Father Matteo Ricci, one of the most famous Jesuit missionaries to China, wrote extensively on Chinese astronomical instruments. He sent sketches back to Rome, sketches which may still be held in sections of the archive, marked Orientalia. But the real intrigue lies with Father Johann Schreck, a German Jesuit and polymath who joined the Ming Dynasty's imperial court, working with Chinese scholars. He helped compile a text known as the Chongjin Calendar Reform, which outlined methods for calculating eclipses, constructing astronomical instruments, and even designing mechanical clocks. Many of Schreck's diagrams were copied and sent back to the Vatican. Some of them survive, but only partial images. The originals, many believe, were placed under restricted status. Why? Because, in part, they contradicted certain assumptions of the time. The Church was struggling with heliocentrism. Galileo had been condemned only decades earlier, even if many within the Church privately accepted the Earth's movement. Public endorsement remained controversial, so when a Jesuit missionary sent back models that implied orbital systems, planetary irregularities, or instruments based on non-Ptolemaic mechanics, the reaction was cautious silence, not censorship, not in the way people often imagine, but containment, placement into sections of the archive where only a handful of trusted scholars could access them. No publication, no commentary, it's just a quiet burial. Over time, many of these papers were mislabeled, or lost, or perhaps still lie there, waiting under covers labeled tracts on mechanical curiosities. There's also the question of the Vatican's relationship with automation. During the Renaissance and Baroque periods, automata were not toys. They were philosophical devices meant to demonstrate the complexity of divine design. Think of the mechanical monk of the 1560s, commissioned by King Philip II of Spain. They could walk, nod, raise a cross, and beat its chest. According to legend, it was inspired by a vision his son had during a grave illness, but the mechanics behind it were known and built by clockmakers with ties to the Church. Somewhere in the archives, there is believed to be a full treatise on that automaton. It's not just theological commentary, but mechanical breakdowns, gear ratios, drawings of tiny jointed limbs. A machine that mimicked prayer. It is perhaps here that the archive touches its most eerie silence. In trying to preserve the sanctity of belief, the Church may have quietly archived away some of the most startling early records of mechanical thinking. Not to hide them, not to destroy them, but to protect them from misuse, misinterpretation, or premature exposure. What's more painful to historians is not knowing what was lost, but suspecting how much more there was. The Vatican's archives are not malevolent. They are massive. And even now, in the 21st century, they remain understaffed. Only a tiny fraction has been digitized. Even fewer pages have been translated or annotated. Imagine a monk in 1691 experimenting with magnetism, writing careful notes about how certain metals seem to attract others without touch. He compares this force to the soul, to divine love. He sketches an instrument with a needle that always turns north. He wonders if it could be used to find one's way in the dark. His notes were copied twice, one version sent to a bishop, the other filed in the archive. Now imagine that his file was placed beneath a sermon that someone else decided was more relevant. The notes became invisible, forgotten. Then, decades later, the binding was replaced. The title on The needle of heaven was misunderstood, assumed to be metaphysical, so it was placed in the theology shelf. Still wrong, still waiting. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of such stories. And it is not about what the Vatican wanted to hide. It is about what humanity forgot to remember as we lie here in quiet thought. What if somewhere in those 53 miles of shelves there lies a description of how to build an early gyroscope, or a note from a Jesuit who observed electrical shocks when walking across woolen rugs in winter, or a letter describing the effect of compressed air on small animals? What if some of the discoveries we attribute to the 18th or 19th centuries were known, barely known, to a few thinkers centuries earlier, but buried, not by design, but by the slow, paper-clogged entropy of time? What would it mean if we recovered them now? You're still here, breathing slowly, your thoughts suspended in the quiet air of a room without windows. Now, follow the dim flicker of a lantern down into the final corridor. Imagine the Vatican Apostolic Archive not as a mystery to be unlocked, but as a forgotten echo to 53 miles of memory, layered not in conspiracy, but in time. We followed the trail of Jesuit polymaths, drawn diagrams with invisible ink, watched water-powered clocks tick without flame or shadow, but we haven't yet reached the heart of the silence. The part where knowledge is not hidden by design, but buried by disinterest, inertia, or simply too much paper. This final section leads us into that most overlooked terrain, the era of modern neglect. By the 19th century, the Vatican Library and Archives, once curated by generations of monastic scribes, Jesuit naturalists, and Renaissance philosophers, had become both vast and fragile. Wars had come and gone. Entire orders had been suppressed, restored, then marginalized again. What remained were rooms filled with bound volumes that no one had opened in centuries. Some were unindexed, others mislabeled, many written in Latin, so archaic even trained scholars struggled to read them without a reference guide. And here we must meet one of the most peculiar figures in this story, Monsignor Alfredo Valenti, an archivist who began work in the early 1930s. He is largely forgotten now, but for those few who studied the Vatican's logistical history, not its theology or politics, but its paperwork, Valenti is a quietly important name. Valenti wasn't a philosopher or an inventor. He was an organizer, an obsessive, quiet man who wore the same fraying gloves every day and believed that every page had its rightful place. He was given the task of reintegrating disordered bundles, a euphemism for sorting out centuries of mixed-up manuscripts that had been shuffled during wars, moves, and rebindings. He didn't seek mystery, but he found it anyway. In 1934, while cataloging a collection of light 17th century sermons from the bishopric of Lyon, Valenti came across a misfiled treatise. It had no cover. Its pages were soft and thin, sewn crudely at one edge with thread that had yellowed with age. The Latin was fluid, full of metaphors, and cross-referenced with Roman poetry. But the subject was not religious. Not directly. It was about pressure. The manuscript described the breadth of the heavens. It's how weight could be measured not only by balance, but by its absence. It discussed the emptiness of a sealed bell jar, the way a bird's lungs collapsed when placed within one, and how such pressure might be harnessed. In the margins were tiny diagrams. A man with a long beard placing a narrow tube in a bowl of mercury, a dial, a curved needle. No name, no clear title. Valenti, not trained in physics, did not grasp the implications. He simply noted in his log, Tractatus de Pneumatica, uncertain author, not theological. He placed it in a box labeled MISC, Mechanics Unbound. He moved on. That treatise has never been found again. In a private letter written in 1942, Valenti confessed that he had tried to locate it later, believing it might have been part of the missing work of Evangelista Torricelli. the Italian physicist who invented the barometer. But the archive had changed hands during the war. Some rooms had been resealed, others evacuated for safety. We do not know if the treatise survived, only that it was seen, and then gone again. How many such moments occurred? We'll never truly know, because the Vatican Archive, despite myths of omniscience, is still, in many ways, an archive of chance. A book might remain hidden, not because it is feared, but because no one has bothered to pull it from the shelf. A page might change your understanding of science or art, but only if it is read. Let's consider one final category, the one most neglected, the fragments. Among the 53 miles of shelves are drawers and cases filled not with books, but with paper scraps, bits of letters, margins torn from ledgers, blotched, half-legible phrases, notes passed between monks, lists of instruments to be built, but never completed, pages so damaged that they can only be handled with tweezers and gloves. In one such drawer, a piece of parchment was found in 1993 that bore only these words, written in delicate Latin: "The machine sings. It turns by fire, and the bell is struck at each hour." Was it a description of a water clock? A primitive steam engine? Ceremonial automaton? No one knows. The rest of the page is missing. Another fragment, this time from a Jesuit mission in Japan, describes a box with reeds and brass coils that speaks without voice. Again, the surrounding text is gone, but scholars have speculated that it may have referred to an attempt to build a rudimentary speaking tube or sound amplifier. Each of these discoveries offers not a full story, but a whisper, a trace. And here's the heart of the matter. The Vatican Archive is not a locked vault of secrets. It is something quieter, sadder. It is a graveyard of forgotten intentions. It's a vast field of abandoned notebooks, each one a monument to something that was nearly discovered, and then wasn't. Because the most dangerous thing in history isn't censorship, it's indifference. Let's imagine one more room, one we can never truly enter. Not because it is forbidden, because we no longer know it exists. The blueprints from the 19th century mention a mechanica minor, a chamber filled with experimental diagrams collected by Jesuit engineers between 1620 and 1750. It was said to house models of early turbines, sealed tubes with magnets inside, and even a wooden globe that rotated using a system of suspended weights. But by 1907, the room had been converted into storage for clerical robes. The artifacts antiqued, the journals removed. The cabinet where the models were kept is now used to store wine for visiting cardinals. If any of the diagrams survived, they are now scattered, perhaps mislabeled as artistic representations or symbolic instruments. And so the question that began this story remains. What secrets were locked inside the Vatican's 53 miles of shelves? Not evil ones, not hidden knowledge meant to control or deceive, but forgotten ones. Simple observations, failed experiments, quiet brilliance that no one followed up on. Drawings made by candlelight in mission houses and monastic libraries. Notes about magnets, levers, wind, light, breath, time. None of it earth-shattering on its own, but together, a shadow map of everything humanity nearly learned before we thought to record it. Perhaps the greatest irony is that the most valuable discoveries weren't destroyed. They were just never opened, and maybe they still sit there. Now, behind a locked wooden door, under a mislabeled folder, between two books of genealogy no one has touched since the 1800s. Waiting, waiting. Let the noise fade now. Let the thoughts you've been following loosen slightly, like the threads of a scroll slowly unraveling in the hands of a tired scribe. You are no longer walking past shelves of experiments, lost inventions, or fragile machines. You are in the quietest part of the archive now. It's not the oldest, not the most secret, but perhaps the most ignored, because this final story is not about objects. It is about words in the way they were silenced, not by fire, but by apathy. It begins not in Rome, but in Prague, and not in the 1600s or the 1700s, but in the year 1847, just 1 year before Europe would begin to unravel into revolutions. A Bohemian priest by the name of Father Miroslav Anton Resnick, known only to a few dioceses and forgotten by nearly everyone else, was writing letters. He was not a theologian of note. He had published no books, but he had spent the previous 12 years traveling through the villages of the Carpathians, tending to parishes so remote they had no names on imperial maps. Resnick had begun collecting strange stories from the rural Orthodox, Armenian, and Roman Catholic communities alike, not legends or superstitions, but curious accounts of sacred anomalies, accounts of strange liturgical practices involving astronomical alignments, claims that churches had been built not merely facing east, but aligned with solstices, reports of priests using circular stones to calculate feast days with unusual precision. He was especially interested in one manuscript he had encountered in a monastery outside Cluj. It contained what he described as a lunar model, not in accordance with Rome's calendar, but remarkably accurate to the day. The locals claimed it had been passed down from Constantinople, though Resnick suspected it was even older. In his letter to the Vatican, which would eventually be filed as document 198B-23, Shelf Series Correspondence, Peripheral Clergy, Resnick asked whether the Church had records of early lunar computation systems, and whether the Gregorian calendar had ever considered integrating such models. It was, essentially, a technical question about astronomy and theology. The letter reached Rome in July of that year and was marked for reply, but no reply ever came. Why? Because the timing was poor. 1847 was the eve of the 1848 revolutions. The Vatican was in disarray. Pius IX had only recently become Pope, and the political tensions in Rome were so severe that the Papal States themselves were at risk of collapse. There were urgent matters of state, of armies, of governance. Strange note from a rural priest about lunar tables was, at best, a curiosity, at worst, an annoyance, and so the letter was filed, quietly, pinned with a rusty clasp to a response draft that was never written. It sat, like thousands of others, in a drawer in the Archivum Miscellaneum, but Resnick kept writing. In 1849, after the revolutions had passed, he sent a second letter. This one was more pointed. He referenced the possible existence of earlier Eastern Christian calendars that deviated from the Julian structure but used mechanisms, wheels, and rods. He wrote, to maintain accuracy without papal intervention. He implied, gently, that such systems might predate the Council of Nicaea. Again, no answer. By 1852, Resnick was becoming desperate. His tone shifted. He no longer asked questions, but offered to deliver the manuscripts he had found. He warned that many of the texts were being sold to collectors in Vienna, and that the monastery where he'd once found the circular lunar table had since been burned. He never received a reply. We know this because his final letter, dated 1854, was returned to sender with a note addressed invalid. He died 2 years later of pneumonia. Is buried in a common grave in Transylvania. The Vatican held his original letters in a folder marked unanswered, Resnick, M.A. It remained unopened for 122 years. It wasn't until 1976 that a Jesuit archivist named Father Luca Bonavita, while compiling a secondary index of obscure calendar-related correspondence, came across the name. He read the letters with growing interest. Kay even noted, in the margin of his log, possibly valuable evidence of pre-Gregorian synchrony models. Investigate further. But Bonavita was reassigned to Madrid the following year. The folder returned to storage. So why does this matter? Because Resnick's story is not unique. It's one of hundreds, perhaps thousands of moments where inquiry met silence, not because of conspiracy, but because of timing, disinterest, paperwork. This is the hidden power of the archive, not in what it reveals, but in what it forgets to answer. Some of Resnick's claims would later resurface. In the 1990s, astronomers studying early Slavic ecclesiastical records found evidence of lunar alignment tables used in calculating Easter, especially among remote Orthodox sects. But by then, Resnick had long been forgotten, and his letters were not cited. A man's life of research vanished to a filing cabinet, and this was not the only example. Let us travel briefly to 1889. Another priest, this time from Belgium, had discovered fragments of correspondence from a Jesuit mission in Goa, India. The letters, penned in the 1600s, described efforts to build a device of equilibrium for measuring rainfall, a kind of inverted barometer crossed with a sundial, meant to predict monsoon patterns. Father Jules Clercq, the Belgian priest, wrote a paper on this and sent it to the Vatican Archive, asking whether any such diagrams from Jesuit India missions had been preserved. His paper, bound in blue cloth, entitled Meteorologium Gaudium, was sent in triplicate. The response: silence. Today, only one copy of Meteorologium Gaudium survives in a basement library in Antwerp, unread since 1902. Again, not a cover-up, just administrative gravity. And that is the true mystery buried inside those 53 miles of shelves. Not grand secrets, but the weight of missed opportunities. Manuscripts that could have contributed to our understanding of meteorology, astronomy, medicine, engineering, lost not to censorship, but to neglect. The Vatican Archive is not a monolith. It is a sponge. It absorbs all things, but it doesn't always know what it's absorbed. And unless someone pulls the thread, the stories remain tightly bound. It's invisible to history. Resnick, single quotes, unanswered letters, Clercq's forgotten treatise, even Valenti's vanished pneumatic manuscript. These are not isolated accidents. They are symptoms of a deeper truth, that history is not made only by what we discover, but by what we choose to look at again. And so, we end section 1 here. Standing beside the folder that was never opened, the letter never answered, the priest never remembered. What would the world look like today if Resnick had been taken seriously? If the church had responded, if his manuscripts had been studied before they were lost to fire, mold, or private hands? What happens when silence becomes policy? Not by intent, but by habit. By habit. There's something particularly heavy about a file that was never read again. You can imagine the faded color of the folder, the handwriting tilted in modest ink, the corner of the paper curling as humidity claimed it year after year. And there it sits between more urgent files, edicts on marriage law, PayPal concerns on diplomatic disputes, lists of land tithes, and between them, forgotten letters. But let us not imagine. Let us simply observe what happened next. By the time the Vatican began standardizing the archive's internal indexing system, in the 20th century, the silence around peripheral correspondence, men like Father Resnick, had become institutional, not deliberate, but expected. The archivists who handled such letters were not censors. They were overworked clerks, many of them monks, fluent in Latin, sometimes Greek, rarely Bohemian. And while they understood the theological implications of feast day calendars or solstice measurements, they were not astronomers, nor engineers, nor travelers. And so, letters like Resnick's were filed, not studied, indexed, not questioned, left for someone else to discover. Someday, but someday, never came. The same pattern began to repeat in other corners of the archive, especially in what was known by staff as the Composita Historica Minor, the minor historical compositions. This was a holding area for documents that didn't fit into known categories, a kind of historical limbo. Let us look, for example, at document CHM 271, written in 1901 by Sister Adelaide Cordy, a Benedictine nun serving in a hilltop convent in the Ligurian Apennines. Her letter described a set of mathematical medallions discovered in the convent's storage cellar, copper discs etched with geometric diagrams that, according to her claims, had once been used by an earlier abbess to teach seasonal planting cycles to illiterate villagers. Sister Cordy included a pencil rubbing of one disc in her letter, a ringed circle with lunar crescents marked at opposing points. She believed the discs were hundreds of years old and possibly connected to ancient agricultural rituals. Christianized during the Carolingian era, she asked the Vatican if anyone had seen similar tools in monastic inventories from France or the German principalities. Her hope, as she wrote, was to restore the educational dignity of the poor who have learned not from books but from symbols. No one responded. The letter was received by an assistant archivist who annotated it with a single word in the margin: folklore. The folder was filed under unverified liturgical tools and left untouched. For 64 years, when it was finally reopened in 1965 during an inventory review, the pencil rubbing had nearly faded. Original copper discs had long been sold to a tourist antique dealer in Genoa. Their whereabouts remain unknown. Again, no conspiracy, no order to silence, just no one available to care. This quiet disregard extended beyond European sources. In 1922, a priest from South India named Father Xavier Briadas wrote to the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, later routed, to the archive about a collection of palm leaf manuscripts discovered near Pondicherry. These manuscripts, written in Tamil and partially translated by local catechists, described a fusion of Christian liturgy with ancient astrological timing, suggesting that Jesuit missionaries in the 1600s had adapted local astronomical systems to match the church calendar in coastal Tamil Nadu. Father Xavier's report included details of a shadow clock used to announce feast days based on equinox readings. He requested confirmation. Had other missionaries in Asia used similar adaptations? Were there records of Vatican approval for such hybridizations? He included rubbings, sketches, and a 6-page translation excerpt. There was no reply. Only a brief log entry, filed as regional devotional practice, not doctrinal. The palm leaf manuscripts were placed in a drawer. Xavier died 2 years later from malaria. No historian ever reviewed his submission. It was rediscovered only in 1991 by a Jesuit researcher cataloging liturgical anomalies. By then, the communities that once used those tools had adopted Western, Gregorian methods, and the original Tamil system had faded from memory. This is the pattern, not destruction, not censorship, just gentle burial under dust. And then there were the correspondents whose very names disappeared. There's one case from 1893, a letter marked only with initials R.H., written in meticulous English. The author claimed to be an engineer-turned-monk, living in Malta. He had been cataloging old stone engravings in an abandoned Carmelite cloister, and claimed that one of the reliefs depicted a device not unlike a pendulum compass, oriented toward magnetic north rather than east. He believed it may have been used for shipbuilding, or bore theological inscriptions in Latin around the base, possibly linking it to symbolic cosmology. He asked whether any church records confirmed the existence of maritime alignment devices used in monasteries connected to naval orders. No name, no further letters, no reply. The folder containing R.H.'s diagram was later moved to the Mechanical Curiosities collection, where it remained until 1987, when it was mistakenly cross-referenced as a nautical relic. The object depicted in the drawing, still unidentified. All these examples, Resnick, Corti, Xavier, R.H., show us not a Vatican bent on hiding knowledge, but one overwhelmed by the sheer weight of what it possessed. When everything is sacred, prioritized, and delicate. Nothing receives attention, and perhaps the most sobering truth is this. Many of the Vatican staff in those years believed they were preserving knowledge, filing it for future generations, making it available to someone better equipped to judge. But in a world of parchment, humidity, fading ink, and undocumented movement of boxes, filing something often meant losing it forever. This is where we return then to the central question of this story. Not what secrets were locked away intentionally, but how many were quietly buried by routine. The archive was never one thing. It was the sum of 2,000 years of accumulation of copyists and scribes, monks and curators, well-meaning administrators, and overwhelmed record keepers. And somewhere within those 53 miles of shelving, tens of thousands of unanswered questions, not heretical, not dangerous, just ignored, wait silently in folders. Folders never opened again. We think of secrets as things hidden by force, but perhaps the most profound secrets of all are those hidden by accident. The shadowed memory of a lunar calendar scratched onto a monastery wall in Bohemia. The silent clock that told villagers when to sow in Liguria. The astrological crossbreed that once timed feasts on a sun-warmed coast in southern India. They are all pieces of a history that we did not decide to erase, only to overlook. And yet, the archive does not forget. It waits. Every letter still exists. Every document. Every unanswered thought. One by one, they wait for someone to read them. The question then is not what was hidden from us. The question is, what have we chosen not to look at? And what else might still be there, quietly waiting to be opened?